the book of Psalms, Psalm 35. I'd like to take up reading with verse 12 and read down through verse 18, and maybe we'll refer back to some of the other of this psalm, but let us begin with verse 12. They rewarded me evil for good to the spoiling of my soul. But as for me, when they were sick, my clothing was sackcloth. I humbled my soul with fasting, and my prayer returned into mine own bosom. I behaved myself as though he had been my friend or brother. I bowed down heavily as one that mourneth for his mother. But in mine adversity they rejoiced and gathered themselves together. Yea, the abjects gathered themselves together against me, and I knew it not. They did tear me and ceased not. With hypocritical mockers in feasts they gnashed upon me with their teeth. Lord, how long wilt thou look on? Rescue my soul from their destructions, my darling from the lions. I will give thee thanks in the great congregation. I will praise thee among much people. The psalmist here is, in these verses especially that we read, sets forth a great contrast. And I want us to look at the phrase in verse 13, and this is the title of the message and kind of the core of our thoughts this evening. These four little words, but as for me. And I want us to think about that. Our text sets forth a contrast between two types of behavior. We see in verse 12 it said, they rewarded me evil for good. And then we see the I, or as me in this case, as for me, in verse 12. And so, or verse 13 then, how they treat me and how I treat them. They treated him badly. And we could go through here. I kind of made a list of some of the things. It says, verse 1, they strive with me. They fight against me. They persecute me. They seek after my soul. They devise my hurt. They devise my hurt, and they do that without a cause. And so he lists all these things here in this psalm that they have done unto him. And he sums it up there in verse 12. They rewarded me evil for good. Here we see through the psalmist an example of how we can expect the world to treat us. I want us to notice this first, and you know, sometimes it seems like that people have this idea, boy, if I become a Christian, then everything's just going to work out great for me. I'm not going to have any problems. You know, the Lord's with me, and He's going to bless me, and I'm not going to have any problems, and you know, and I just love God and love everybody, and everybody's going to love me back, and you know, that's kind of the idea that people have. But Jesus warned us. Notice Gospel of John chapter 15. Verse 18. Jesus says, if the world hates you, you know it hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love his own. But because you're not of the world, but I have chosen you out of the world, therefore the world hateth you. So he says, if the world hates you, well, actually there's no if to it. Verse 20, said, remember the word that I send you, the servant is not greater than his Lord. If they have persecuted me, they will also persecute you. If they've kept my sayings, they will keep yours also. But he said, you know, they persecuted me. They persecuted me without a cause. And so we see from that phrase, going back to the psalmist, how that they did these things. They hated him without a cause. And so, if the world hated Jesus Christ without a cause, and they persecuted him, Jesus says they will also persecute you. They're going to hate you. There's no cause for it other than that enmity between the lost, rebellious world and God that exists. And when we're separated unto God, we're on his side, and the world's going to take up arms, if you will, against us, because there's enmity between them and God. So the Bible warns us, as Christ's disciples, what kind of treatment we can expect from the world. And when I say from the world, those that are lost, and that may include your friends, that may include your neighbors, may even include members of your family, and they may persecute you. Now, it may not be the type of thing where they'll throw literally sticks and stones at you, but they may say things, treat you unfairly, say mean and hurtful things to you. And when that happens, we have a choice. In life, we do have choices as to how we are to respond. Let us notice, and Jesus, who saved us, loved us, gave himself for us, has redeemed us. And we see he has set an example for us to follow. And he has commanded us to follow in his steps. In 1 Peter chapter 2, again, as we go back, and he said, now, if they've treated me poorly, they're going to treat you poorly. At the same time, as we notice how Jesus responded to that, this is an example to us then how we should respond when we are treated in the same manner. In 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 22, speaking of Jesus Christ, here he says, who did no sin, neither was guile found in his mouth, who when he was reviled, reviled not again. When he suffered, he threatened not, but committed himself to him that judges righteously. And so, when they reviled him, or they said all kinds of mean stuff to him, he didn't revile back. He did not respond in kind to their treatment of him. When they persecuted him, he suffered at their hands. He didn't threaten them back what he was going to do. Because this is the way the world reacts. Now, the world not only persecutes and treats God's people mean, they treat one another mean. They're constantly being mean to one another. And their response, in the world, when somebody treats them mean, they're going to be mean right back. And we see this one-upmanship kind of competition begins, You give me a little shove, I'm going to shove you back a little harder. Well, then that person responds by shoving back a little harder than before. And then there it goes to somebody's on the ground and they're into a fist fight and whatever. That's the way the world reacts. That's the way the natural man, our natural responses. The old nature that is in man, that's how it reacts. And so, and Jesus is telling us here, now in this life, not only is there that natural fighting between people, but when you become a child of God and you're called out of the world, you're in the world, but you're not of the world anymore, then there's that natural enmity that the world has toward God, and the things of God is now going to be directed at you. And so when that happens, God does not want us to continue to respond in the same way that we used to. I just thought that verse of Scripture, it's not in my notes, but in Ephesians chapter 2, he talks about here how that we were quickened. He said we were dead in trespasses and in sins. And he begins to describe the way we lived, the way we conducted ourselves when we were lost, when we were dead in trespasses and in sins. He said, wherein in time past you walked according to the course of this world. That is, you were just like this world. You was going in the same direction. You thought the same way. You acted the same way. You reacted the same way, and so on. He said, according to the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that now worketh in the children of disobedience, among whom also we all had our conversation, or manner of life, how we lived our lives in times past, and so on. And so, that's the way we used to live, but now you're a new creature. Any man be in Christ, he's a new creature. So the old things are passed away, and behold, all things are become new. We're created in Christ Jesus unto good works, which God hath before ordained that we should walk in them. There are some things, and God has said from the beginning, this is how I want you to live. This is how man was created, intended to live in fellowship with God, upright, without sin. And so he wants us to live, and he's made us a new creature. And the Holy Spirit dwells in us to help us, to reveal these things to us, to convict us of sin, to guide us in the right way, and to teach us the right things to do, and empower us to do these things. And so, you're a new creature. Notice, if you will, 1 Corinthians chapter 4. 1 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 11. Paul is making a comment here. He says, even unto this present hour we both hunger and thirst, and are naked, and are buffeted, and have no certain dwelling place, and labor, working with our own hands, being reviled, we bless, being persecuted, we suffer. That is, we endure it. Being defamed, we entreat. We are made as the filth of the world, and are the offscourging of all things unto this day. That's... Paul is an apostle. He was out there in front. I mean, he was out there face to face with the world, dealing with the world and its sin, preaching the gospel to them. And this is how I'm viewed and how I'm treated. And so he says, when we're being reviled, so we bless. And so on. Notice that this is exactly what Jesus taught the disciples to do in Matthew chapter 5. Verse 43. Jesus was during the Sermon on the Mount and his elaborating upon his kingdom, and he's going back, and he said, I did not come to do away with the law. He said there's not one jot, one tittle of the law is going to fail till it's all been fulfilled. He didn't come to do away, he established it, he fulfills it. But what had happened in the meantime, especially during those 400 years of silence, after the children of Israel had come back out of captivity and began to rebuild and resettle the land, and there was no prophets, there was no men coming under the direct inspiration of God and speaking to them. And they had kind of settled in, and being in captivity in Babylon, you know, what a pagan, a wicked place. They picked up some bad habits. And they brought it back into the land with them. They picked up some bad attitudes. And they began to incorporate those things into how they taught the law. So when Jesus came, He was rebuking them many times because He said, your traditions, the things which the fathers, they wasn't going back to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, not the patriarch, but their fathers during that time of the 400 years of silence had added these traditions. They had added their teachings. They had created loopholes, if you will, in the law for themselves. And this had become what they were dealing with. And these things are right up there with the Ten Commandments, with the instructions that Moses gave. And so, from their perspective, if you ridicule or do away with this, you're doing away with the law. No, He was correcting it. He was correcting the abuses. He was correcting the errors and the human teachings and ideas that they had added to the law. And so, in verse 43, He says, you have heard that it hath been said, thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate thine enemy. Now the Bible does teach, God did command, we're to love our neighbor. God didn't say anything about hating our enemies. That's what the fathers added. Verse 4, but I say unto you. Now He's not teaching something new. He's going back and reinforcing the original intent of the commandments. Love your enemies. Bless them that curse you. Do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be the children of your Father which is in heaven. For He maketh His sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and sendeth rain on the just and on the unjust. You know, and He's given that comparison. You know, this world is full of people that have rejected God, that have no use for God, have no thought much one way or the other about God. And they go about their lives and do their thing. The sun still rises and sets on them just as it does on God's people that are obedient and humble and seek to do His will. And the rains for the crops, that the crops grow, He sends His rain on the just and the unjust alike. And Jesus is saying, you know, that's how we need to treat one another. You're not to be selective and say, well, now, those that treat me good, I'm going to treat them good. And those that, you know, are my enemies and seek me ill, then I'm going to treat them bad. Because I can't expect any good treatment from them, so I'm going to treat them bad. He said, that's not the way God works. And that's not how He wants you to live. He says, for if you love them which love you, what reward have ye? Do not even the publicans the same? You know, and when He said the publicans, He's kind of rubbing it in because, in other words, He's saying to the scribes and the Pharisees, even those people you look down on, despise, don't do any differently than what you're teaching. By nature, they do the same thing that you're teaching. And they thought they were so much better than the publicans. And He said, if you salute your brethren only, what do ye more than others? Do not even the publicans so? Be ye therefore perfect, even as your Father which is in heaven is perfect. In other words, it goes back to that example. He causes his sun to rise on the good and the evil. He sends his rain on the just and the unjust. And we're to love everyone the same. And so he says, bless them. Love your enemies. Bless them that curse you. Do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you. Now, isn't that what the psalmist said he did? You know, we go back there in our text. He said, when they were sick, he said, my clothing was sackcloth. And the idea is there of humbling oneself and mourning, grieving with them. You know, if he was sick, I shared his grief. I mourned over him. He said, I humbled my soul with fasting. And he prayed, because prayer and fasting kind of goes, he was praying for the recovery of that person. He was praying for their soul. And not only that, he says, when he prayed for him, said his prayer returned into mine own bosom. In other words, I believe what that's saying, you know, when you are really invested in someone and you love them and you're praying for them and you see what their needs are and you're praying for them and you realize, I have the means to meet that need. That prayer comes back to you and God convicts you, I need to do something for that person. Here's something I can do. And so you go and help them. And so that's why he's referring to my prayer returned into mine own bosom. He said, I behaved myself. And so here's what he said, I behaved myself toward that person as though he had been my friend, as though he had been my brother. He said, I bowed down heavily, or with heaviness, as one that mourned for his mother. Now, you can't get much closer than that, can you? He said, but as for me, and that's the thing, the contrast he puts, that phrase puts between them and me. How they behave and how I behave. They may behave in this way, and I can't help that. I can't climb into somebody else's head and straighten out their thinking. I can't make them treat me the way I want to be treated. But I can choose to treat them the way I want to be treated myself. And that's what that phrase encapsulates for us this evening. And the reason, as I was reading that and I saw that verse and just saw that phrase, it just one of those things that at the time I read it, it grabbed my attention. And I was thinking about that, but as for me, it's what the psalmist said. In spite of the way he had been treated, he treated them right. And even when he treated them right, they continued to treat him badly. But that didn't change his responsibility. In other words, you know, we know that the phrase, the golden rule, and actually I have that in my notes here, that we're to do unto others as we would have others to do unto us. But don't do that expecting that's going to change them. Don't do that thinking, okay, now they've mistreated me and everything, but if I'm good to them, then they'll turn around and be good to me. No, not necessarily. Most likely not. But our responsibility doesn't change. Our responsibility is not conditioned on how they behave. Our responsibility is to God. And as we talked about this morning, God is true. God doesn't change. And so what He wants us to do doesn't change. How we're to live is based on what God tells us to do. What He wants us to do is not based on how others behave. But as for me, as I read that, and I say, the psalmist could have been a New Testament writer. He could have been one of the apostles or something, recording what Jesus said. As we read that, when they were sick, it said, I was mourning for them. I humbled my soul with fasting and prayer. My prayer returned. Said I had to do something, deeds as well as words. I behaved myself as though. And so we look in the Gospel of Luke chapter 6. Luke chapter 6. In verse 27, Jesus said, but I say unto you which hear. Now, you have ears to hear what he is saying to you. And the thing is, if we're saved, we have ears to hear. If you claim to be saved, you claim to be a child of God, then you're going to hear this, and you're going to be responsible. He said, love your enemies. Do good to them which hate you. Bless them that curse you, and pray for them which despitefully use you. And unto him that smiteth thee on one cheek, offer also the other. And him that taketh away thy cloak, forbid not to take away thy coat also. Give to every man that asketh of thee, and of him that taketh away thy goods, ask them not again. And as ye would that men should do to you, do ye also to them likewise. In Matthew 7:12, much the same thing. Matthew 7:12. Again, part of the Sermon on the Mount. He says, therefore, all things whatsoever ye would that men should do to you, do ye even so to them, for this is the law and the prophets. So that principle is based on the commandments. That's why he said, 2 commandments. The first, the greatest commandment, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy strength, with all thy soul. The second is like unto it, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. He said, on these 2 commandments hang all the law and the prophets. And so he just, again, in different words, has said much the same thing. To love thy neighbor as thyself. If you love your neighbor, you will seek to do no ill to your neighbor. And he's kind of turning it just a little bit and restating it. But all things whatsoever ye would that men should do to you. See, how is it you love yourself? How is it you'd like to be treated? If you're sick, what do you want people to do for you? When you're hurting, what do you want people to do for you? He says, well, when your neighbor, and that includes your enemies, because sometimes our neighbors can be enemies. You ever lived next to some cantankerous individual that just mean-spirited all the time? Well, he's your neighbor. And Jesus pointed out in the parable of the Good Samaritan, your neighbor is basically anybody you come across, that you cross paths with. That's your neighbor. And you're to treat them. You're to love them. And to treat them the same way that if you was in a similar situation, how you would like to be treated yourself. That's loving your neighbor as yourself. And here he kind of, by turning it around and rephasing it a little bit, he's saying the same thing, but maybe this way we can get it. Therefore, all things whatsoever ye would that men should do to you, do ye even so to them. For this is the law and the prophets. That's what it's all about. And that's pretty much what the psalmist says he did. And that's the reason this is so important for us as we look at this. But as for me, denotes that you will behave differently from them. See, it's drawing a contrast, not just comparing, but it's drawing a contrast. They act one way, I'm going to act differently. What you say, but as for me, it says there's a difference, and I'm going to act different. They act one way, but as for me, I'm going to do something different. Joshua also used that phrase. Now, I don't know, there may be, I'd love to kind of do a search, haven't had time to do it yet, and see if there's any other places where that phrase is used, and kind of do a study of it. But Joshua also used that phrase. Joshua chapter 24. This was toward the end of his time as the leader. He replaced Moses and led the children of Israel in the conquest of the land. Now the time had come. They had conquered or driven out the majority of those that lived in the land. And just like God warned them, if you leave any of them behind, they're going to be a thorn in your side, and they were. But at this point, they had come to a point, and they said, okay, we've conquered the land, we control the land, and we're going to settle down now and just go about living our lives. And so Joshua's responsibility as leading them in the conquest of the land is coming to a close. And before he retires into private life, if you will, he comes before them. And in Joshua chapter 24 and verse 14, he says, "Now therefore fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and in truth. And put away the gods which your fathers served on the other side of the flood and in Egypt, and serve ye the Lord." Now evidently there are some of them they served and worshipped like the Egyptians. They picked up some bad habits. That's what God says, that evil communications corrupt good manners. When you hang around wrong kind of people, I mean, if you make friends with them, you hang with them, you do things together, you're going to pick up their bad habits. That's just human nature. That's the way we are. And he warns us about that. And so, before they picked up bad habits. And he says, now, you need to put those things away. Verse 15, he said, "And if it seem evil to you to serve the Lord." He said, now you have a choice. He said, you should serve the Lord. You should serve him in sincerity and truth. You should put away those gods. He said, however, if it seem evil to you to serve the Lord, choose you this day whom you will serve. Whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the flood, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me, he's saying, look, I already made my choice, and whatever you choose to do, that's your business. But it's not going to change me. It's not going to change what I've purposed that I'm going to do. You should serve the Lord. He's the one who brought you up out of Egypt. He's the one who's redeemed you. He's the one who's given you this land. You ought to serve him. But if you choose not to, it's not going to change what I'm going to do. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And the people answered and said, God forbid that we should forsake the Lord to serve other gods. For the Lord our God, He it is that brought us up and our fathers out of the land of Egypt, from the house of bondage, and which did those great signs in our sight, and preserved us in all the way wherein we went, and among all the people through whom we passed. And the Lord drave out from before us all the people, even the Amorites which dwelt in the land. Therefore will we also serve the Lord, for He is our God. So, in life, we have choices to make. And those around us have those choices to make as well. But you need to choose for yourself. This is between you and God, and obviously, you ought to serve the Lord. If you say you're saved, you ought to be serving the Lord. We was talking with someone the other day, talking about these people, and they claim to be saved, they go to church, they get baptized, and it seemed like that person thought, if I get baptized, something miraculous is going to happen in my life, and all my problems are going to go away. And it didn't. It's like, religion is not some good luck charm. It's a way of life. It's a commitment. Seems like they were looking for someone else to come along and solve all their problems. Now, our biggest problem is sin. And Jesus came and died for us to take away our sin, to redeem us unto Himself. But He doesn't make all of our problems go away, because most of the problems we have is because of the choices we made. But He comes alongside us and He tells us, this is what you need to do. And this is how you need to behave. And if you do this, and you do it consistently, and I'm with you, I'm alongside you, and that's the reason He said, come unto me, take my yoke upon you. Learn of me. He's not just going to come and solve all your... He's going to come alongside, harness up to you, and He will lead you step by step through life and show you this is what you need to do. And you need to do it. And we have a responsibility too. We have the responsibility to make those choices, to do the right things. And He's there to show us what those things are. Now we can ignore it and do our own thing. That's what got you in trouble to start with. And so the children of Israel here, at least at this point, had enough sense. And I believe these people meant it. So God forbid that we should serve these other gods didn't bring us up out of Egypt. These other gods didn't preserve us in the wilderness. These other gods didn't preserve us through all these people that we have come. These other gods didn't deliver this land into our hands. God forbid that we should worship and serve these other gods. The Lord, He is our God, and He's the one that we will serve. And I'm sure that made Joshua glad. But even if they hadn't, it wasn't going to change what he had purposed to do, because he said, but as for me. And we see from the account that generation, they served the Lord. It was another generation that grew up that didn't know Joshua, didn't know these elders, had not seen those miracles, that grew up in the land that turned away from the Lord. Matthew 7. We go back here, kind of actually pick up where we stopped reading in verse 12, Matthew 7, verse 13. Verse 12, let us read this again. He says, therefore all things whatsoever ye would that men should do to you, do ye even so to them, for this is the law and the prophets. Verse 13 says, enter ye in at the strait gate. For wide is the gate, and broad is the way that leadeth to destruction, and many there be which go in thereat. Because strait is the gate, and narrow is the way which leadeth unto life, and few there be that find it. Few that seek it. None that seeketh after God. No, not one. But as I said, we have this choice. Now we can follow the multitude to do evil. We can allow the world and those around us to make those choices for us. That's what a lot of people do. Now sometimes we refer to it as peer pressure. Kid comes home wearing his jeans down around his knees or something. Mom says, what are you doing, boy? You know? Well, everybody else is doing it. Well, what are you going to say? Well, everybody else is doing it. Or are you going to say, but as for me? It's kind of the choice you have. You can do what everybody else is doing. You can kind of hide in amongst the crowd and not draw attention to yourself. Because I guarantee you walk differently. You're going to get their attention. And it's not going to be favorable. I guarantee you'll have plenty of opportunities to bless them that hate you. And do good to them that curse you and persecute you. There won't be very many people on that path. It says, few there be that find it. But we're not to choose a path or a course for our life, a behavior or lifestyle based on what everybody else is doing. We're to choose to do that which is right. That which God tells us is right. Simple phrase. Just 4 words. But what a difference those 4 words make. And what they can mean. However, don't say it boastfully. Like Peter did. Now, he didn't use those exact words, but what he said was pretty much the same thing. Notice Matthew 26. Matthew 26, verse 31. This is after they had partaken of the Passover. He had instituted the Lord's Supper. They sang a hymn. They went out to the Mount of Olives. Verse 31 said, then said Jesus unto them, all ye shall be offended because of me this night. For it is written, I will smite the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock shall be scattered abroad. But after I am risen again, I will go before you into Galilee. Now look what Peter says. Peter answered and said unto him, though all men shall be offended because of thee, yet I never be offended. What does he say? Well, as for me, everybody else may do that, but as for me, no, I'll never do that. And Jesus said to him, verily I say unto thee, that this night before the cock crow, thou shalt deny me thrice. And Peter said to him, though I should die with thee, yet will I not deny thee. Likewise also said all the disciples. They wasn't going to be outdone by Peter. Yet human nature, you would think that they had been around him long enough to know you don't go around contradicting what he says. And he even quoted scripture, "It is written." Now that should have settled it. Peter said, no, I don't care what you say. I don't care what other people. I'm not going to do that. And of course he did. We must realize that we need God's grace and help to be able to fulfill this commandment. We can say, "But as for me," but to carry it out, we're going to need His help and His strength. Philippians chapter 2. Paul learned this in 2 Corinthians. You know, when God had given him that thorn in the flesh, and he had asked the Lord to remove it from him. Asked him 3 times. Paul was rather persistent about that. And then Jesus said, "My grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness." My strength, it's realized, it's brought out, it's manifested, it's perfected in your weakness. Paul caught on quick, and he said, "Okay, I'll glory then in my infirmities. Because when I'm weak, then I'm strong. When I acknowledge my weakness and I lean on the Lord Jesus Christ, that's when I find true strength." And so, later when he writes over in the book of Philippians, Philippians chapter 2, let's notice verse 12. He says, "Wherefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, not as in my absence only, but now much more, or in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling." It's, you know, you have the responsibility. I can't do it for you. I cannot live your life for you. I can't go through life making all your decisions for you and telling you what you need to do. You know the Lord. You know what He says. You need to do these things on your own, whether I'm here or whether I'm not here. That's why He's talking about work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. Not working in order to be saved, but because they are saved, and this is the life a saved person is supposed to live. They're to work that out, manifest that day by day. And he says in verse 13, "For it is God which worketh in you." You know, he said, we're laborers together with God. It's God that worketh in you. You're supposed to work out your own salvation, but you're not doing it alone. It's God in you, both to will and to do of His good pleasure. Not only does God give us the desire, you know, He shows us something in His Word. He convicts our heart and says, you know, this is what I want you to do, and we have that conviction. This is what I need to do, but I don't know if I can. He said He works in both to will and to do. He gives you ability. You can. And that's what Paul says over in chapter 4 then, and verse 13. "I can do all things through Christ, which strengthens me." But you need to keep that in mind. Don't just say this boastfully. But we need to be able to say and have that attitude. "But as for me," it doesn't make any difference how other folks treat me. As for me, I'm going to treat them, and I'm going to treat people the way God has told me I'm supposed to treat people. I'm going to love them, and I'm going to treat them as I would like to be treated. When it comes to serving and following the Lord, you know, I don't care what other people do. As for me and my house, we're going to serve the Lord. We're going to follow the Lord. I've told people, I've used this phrase, I'm a Christian by conversion. I'm a Baptist by conviction. Because of what I believe the Bible teaches, I could never be anything else. And so it doesn't matter to me what other people do, what other people say, what they believe. As for me, these are the things God has convicted me of. And to be consistent with and true to those convictions. I could never be anything else. I see others around that little by little, one issue or another, have departed from what they once said they believed. Need to pray for them, love them. But God's grace, as for me, I want to continue in the faith and practice those things that was once delivered unto the saints, as the Lord has shown me and convicted me of. Whatever course others choose to take. Jeremiah chapter 6. And then Jeremiah chapter 7. Jeremiah chapter 6, verse 16. Thus saith the Lord. Look beyond Jeremiah. This is what the Lord has said. You know, sometimes people want, well, that's just what you think, that's what you believe. No, this is what the Lord says. Thus saith the Lord, stand ye in the ways, and see, and ask for the old paths, where is the good way, and walk therein. So this is what God is telling His people. This is what you need to do, because you've departed from these things. And so you need to stop and consider your ways. You need to look at all these different ways. And you need to ask and inquire, what was the old past? How did God's people serve you in the past? And when you find out what that is, then it's what you need to walk in. And you shall find rest for your souls. The next sentence, how sad. But they said, we will not walk therein. And that was their answer. Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 23. But this thing commanded I them, saying, obey my voice, and I will be your God, and ye shall be my people. And it kind of reminds me of what he said there in 2 Corinthians, the 6th chapter there, verse 14, talking about, come out from among them, be ye separate, be not unequally yoked together with unbelievers, but come out from among them, be ye separate, and I'll receive you unto myself, and I will be your God, and you will be my sons and daughters, saith the Lord. He says, obey my voice, and I will be your God, and you shall be my people, and walk ye in all the ways that I have commanded you, that it may be well unto you. This is for our good. God has commanded these things for our good, for our benefit, for our blessing, because it's the right way. But they hearkened not, nor inclined their ear, but walked in the counsels and in the imaginations of their evil heart. They went backward and not forward. But people today are such an attitude. If we want to go back to the old paths, they say, well, man, you want to go back into the Stone Age. You want to go back, But spiritually, you're going forward. If you're doing what's right, you're doing what God says, even though people used to do it, now they're not. You're not going back, but you're going forward. They got it turned around. And God says because they wouldn't. He said you've gone backwards and not forwards. They hearken not. And that may be the way the majority of people do. But remember those 4 words. Let that be your motto. Your mantra, if you will. No matter what everybody else is doing. No matter what course they choose for themselves. But as for me. Just because everybody else is going the broad way, the wide gate and the broad way, doesn't mean you have to. Nobody's going to force you to serve the Lord or not to serve the Lord. You have a responsibility and you have a choice. And you can't do it on your own, but if you seek God's help, I touched about that, the examples there in the apostles, the disciples. Jesus said, if you had faith, he said, we believe, help our unbelief. We believe, but it's not as strong as it should be. Help our unbelief. He works in you both to will and to do of His good pleasure. Understand and accept your weakness and inability, but purpose to do right anyway and seek God's help and strength in doing it. But as for me, you can choose differently. You can choose to follow the Lord. Remember those words. I'm sure there'll be many times that you will come into situations, and the Lord will bring that into your remembrance. And you'll think of those 4 words, but as for me. And I hope you do. That needs to be there as a reminder to us all the times when we are tempted to ignore God's word and just to follow the crowd. Never follow the multitude to do evil. Say, but as for me, I'm going to serve the Lord. As for me, however they may treat me, I'm going to do right. I'm going to do good. I'm going to love my neighbor. I'm going to love my enemy. I'm going to do good to them. And when I'm persecuted, I'm just going to endure it by God's grace and keep on going. Let us stand.